and welcome to this week's edition of Behind the Headlines. I'm Regan King, and I'm joined as always by my good friend and co-host Simon Barrett. We have a very important question that we're asking this evening. Is uncontrolled mass immigration an existential threat to the West? Now, certainly we have seen the erosion of our Judeo-Christian values across so much of Western society. And what we're going to be unpacking is how this has opened the door, quite literally in more ways than one, Simon, to acceptance of ideologies as equally valid that are leading to the erosion of the very values that make for a healthy civilization.
And of course, and also what this does as well is a globalist policy of open doors and no borders, which is allowing the creation of almost like a global society that actually breaks down and destroys the nation state. And effectively, we're in like 3 or 4 decades into this, but this has been highlighted by a very powerful an emotional speech made by Suella Braverman, our Home Secretary at the American Enterprise Institute last week in Washington D.C, where she described that uncontrolled, illegal migration poses an existential threat to the West. And it's not only Britain that's dealing with this huge migrant crisis. Europe is dealing with it. The United States is struggling to deal with it. Effectively, the Western world is struggling to deal with it. And if our governments don't act soon, this could be what brings down Western civilization.
Well, localizing the problem, the British government particularly has struggled to deal with the extent of illegal migration, particularly via small boats coming across the channel from France. Little has been done on the French side, admittedly, but very little is being done in the UK as well to make sure that there's enough deterrence in place and also enough provisions in place that would allow for other forms of legal immigration for those who have legitimate claim to asylum. So this evening we are going to be unpacking Suella Braverman's powerful speech that she gave in Washington D.C. We're going to be discussing the existential threat of mass uncontrolled immigration to our Western values and our culture as well. And we're going to be asking you, the viewer, to consider the question as well: will the immigration crisis that we're seeing lead to a one-world government?
Well, when you actually break down what she said, and it was a very brave, it was a very courageous speech in Washington, D.C. at the American Enterprise Institute, which is a neoconservative think tank in Washington, D.C. I spent many hours in that place. It's considered one of the finest American conservative think tanks. And so for our Home Secretary to make a speech there, which she called for the reform of the entire global immigration system, essentially, was a very powerful but very provocative. And of course, the problem with her speech is it's been sensationalized and completely taken out of context, saying that she's offended women, she's offended gay people, but without really unpacking what she actually said in her speech to identify the problem. So on Tuesday, the 26th of September, the American Enterprise Institute in Washington, D.C., our Home Secretary made a powerful speech warning about the dangers of mass, uncontrolled and illegal migration and the dangers of multiculturalism poses an existential threat to the West. She started off her speech by saying that in 2022, there were 330,000 illegal border crossings into the EU and detected a 66% increase since 2021. She says that America faces similar challenges as thousands entering the US on a daily basis, and that has risen from 2 million in 2021 to 2.8 million in 2023. She said this presents a permanent and structured challenge to developed nations unless we act, and it's caused by war, political instability, and climate change are making matters worse. It says, according to the UN, at the end of 2022, some 108 million people had been forcibly displaced globally, and 29 million were considered refugees by the UN's own agency to deal with refugees.
Now, in 2023, the World Economic Forum announced illegal migration would be one of the top 5 global threats. We've talked about the WEF on many occasions here, and it is interesting that they actually do identify this as a threat. But in a poll conducted in 2021, some 900 million people expressed a desire to leave their country permanently, and of course that would be for all manner of different reasons. I guarantee that there are probably some people in this country who have expressed a desire to leave it permanently as well. On a particular poll, 481 million, or 37% of the population of sub-Saharan Africa, wanted to leave. In the Middle East or North Africa, that was 27% of the population, or 156 million people. 40 million people saw Britain as their preferred destination, and there's all manner of reasons for that, I'm sure. 162 million saw the U.S. as their preferred destination, more than half of our current climate. Now, the U.K. would be a place that many would identify as desirable because it has a history of being a tolerant nation. It's been a sanctuary for people seeking to flee persecution, and has definitely sought to consider and value the rights of individuals who've been fleeing religious persecution. But in addition to the reality of legitimate claims to asylum, there will be many people who have the idea and the notion that they can arrive in the United Kingdom, and I've met people who've had this idea, and that they wrongly, now anyway, assume that they will have access to free health care. They won't, and they don't. They'll have access to benefits. They won't, and they don't until they meet certain criteria, but there's at least a 2-year wait before they have access to any special privileges. And then beyond that, this idea that kind of the streets are paved with gold. One example, man I knew came here as a refugee from Iraq during the ISIS crisis. You could make a case and say he had a claim for asylum, but to be honest, and he knew this, the city where he was fairly safe and a fairly stable city, much more Western, at least by Middle Eastern standards, and fairly distant from where ISIS was active. He was here for a few months before deciding that he was far more comfortable and had a much better life back in Iraq than he had here, and so he went back to Iraq. This is the case for many, but others persist and do so with varying motivations.
But isn't it extraordinary? I mean, some of these figures that are quoted by Suella Braverman, that, for example, 27% of the population of the entire North Africa and the Middle East either want to live in this country or they want to live in the States. And if you consider how much that these individuals no longer want to live in the Middle East, whether it's due to kind of wars, whether it's to do with droughts, famines, food shortages, and they want a kind of Western lifestyle. They want and with the access to the internet on their phones, they see the West as being very glamorous, very materialistic. They want a piece of the pie, essentially. But yet our own Western countries are going through turmoil because people are trying to bring the country down from within. You know, there's a lack of patriotism. There's a lack of sense of community these days. Everything is fundamentally wrong with the West, as painted by the kind of Marxists, including organizations like Black Lives Matter and everything else. So it's interesting how, if our nations are so awful, that there are so many people that want to flee and come to live here, which must mean that we are incredibly privileged to be born in Britain or to be born in the West and to live in these countries. And and Suella Braverman makes 4 key arguments regarding uncontrolled mass illegal immigration. And if you get a chance, please watch her speech, because it's a very powerful speech, full of facts, full of information, where she defends the nation state. She says here that the nation state is one of humanity's great civilizational stabilizing forces. It creates a shared identity, purpose. Patriotism inspires people to heroism and kindness, and an obligation to help their fellow citizens, and a nationality is for everyone. It says integration takes time, and uncontrolled migration makes it harder for society to adopt and adapt to new cultures, customs, and for communities to stick together. Now, isn't it interesting that essentially the nation state is God's idea? And we saw with the Tower of Babel, for example, that they all had one language, they could all communicate, and then after God struck the Tower of Babel down and everyone spoke in different languages, of where we have now the whole concept of the nation state. And it's God that sets the boundaries and the borders of nations. And of course, we're living in this kind of globalist age now, where this is seen as something archaic. This is not modern, this is not progressive, and therefore we need to cooperate on a kind of global level. So therefore we don't need borders anymore, we don't need the nation state anymore. And I think this is where this mass, uncontrolled, illegal immigration is being used to bring down the nation state in our time.
As you've already mentioned, there's been a great degree of sensationalization of Suella Braverman's speech. And if you take some of the quotes that were flung out there and you look at them, you think, oh, wow, this is quite full on, or this is not overly helpful, this is a great speech. I'm not certain if I agree, but then in context, when you consider what she's talking about, remember that she herself is an ethnic minority, okay? This is not about multiple ethnicities in the nation state. We've already said that Britain is widely recognized as a very tolerant place to multiple nationalities. That's a very, very good thing. Long may that continue. Multiculturalism is not about multiple ethnicities present. Multiculturalism is an ideology that says we are all the same. It's rooted in pluralism, which has its spiritual and religious consequences as well, where even though you are approaching life with a fundamentally different worldview, your worldview, your cultural beliefs that are attached to that worldview walk hand in hand in equality and value with mine, even though I'm approaching it from a very, very different place myself. So what we miss out when we adopt these ideologies and ways of thinking is we leave aside all of the ramifications of toxic, messed up worldviews. And yet then we complain about Sharia law being practiced by certain places. So we have the World Cup in Qatar, and everyone was going mental over Qatar hosting the World Cup, right? And everyone's going to be losing it again if Saudi succeeds and having it in their new city in maybe 8 to 12 years time. So you know, everyone's losing it about that. Why? Because they hate gays, is what people were saying. They don't allow drinking, and we're going to have many problems because you know, European fans like their beer. You know, they mistreat women, they discriminate, and all of this. And we paint this picture, an accurate picture of that worldview, an accurate picture of that society, deeply embedded in that religious ideology. But suddenly, when we come to these shores, it's equally valid, or it's equally valuable, or we assume naively that individuals who are approaching British life from that perspective and from that worldview are doing so with the best of intentions. And so we sell our football clubs, we sell our businesses, we try to incorporate. And what's happening is, rather than many of these who are coming as part of this uncontrolled mass immigration, who are not legitimate refugees, they're not legitimate asylum seekers in many cases, rather than having an expectation of assimilation and acclimatization to our country, to Britain, we just embrace and adopt. But part of that, Simon, I have to reiterate that, is because we have lost our identity.
Exactly.
We have lost our cultural moorings. What exactly does Britain have behind its and on its foundation anyway? And that's why we just assimilate
secular materialism,
Yes.
essentially what we got to offer. I mean, I think the term you're referring to is cultural relativism.
That's it.
Which took off in California and saying that all cultures and societies are equal, when we know they're not. If you look at the West has been founded on our Judeo-Christian heritage that has given the West its moral standing, as it were, which is very different from other parts of the world that are that are being influenced by other different religions and cultural systems. So, I mean, we also see that Suella Braverman has attacked multiculturalism. She says that uncontrolled migration and multiculturalism has become toxic for Europe for the last few decades. She quotes the former German Chancellor Angela Merkel in 2010 speech, where she said that multiculturalism had utterly failed, as well as former President Nicolas Sarkozy of France and British Prime Minister David Cameron, who made speeches around the same sort of time.
These are political liberals as well. I think it's helpful to recognize.
But it's interesting how 10 years on, we're not having, this is the real first time since over a decade that we have heard any political leader make these type of speeches. I mean, she also says that multiculturalism makes no demands of the incomer and has failed to integrate and allows people to come to the country and live parallel lives in it. As she said, they could be in society but not of society. Says in the extreme cases could be pursuing and undermining the stability and threatening the security of society, and that we are living with the consequences of that failure today. And she says you can see it play out all over Europe. Says national identity and the nation state means something to all of us and must be protected. I mean, we're living in a time now where we're seeing a huge influence of globalism within our politics and on our news agenda, that the whole concept of the nation state is presented as an outdated system. But here we are, we have Suella Braverman actually fighting for the nation state. And I think it's imperative that we maintain the nation state, because the nation state is the best way and the best order of society, and also how nations interact. She says that in the last 25 years, we've seen more migration to Europe than at any other time. So let's just remind ourselves of the huge migration crisis that Europe faced back in 2015 as a warning of the dangers that lie ahead with illegal, uncontrolled migration.
It's a staggering humanitarian crisis, the largest refugee influx since World War II. More than 300,000 Africans and Asians have crossed Europe's border this year, double last year's pace. Hundreds more have died trying in just the past few weeks. But the other side of this tragedy is how it will change Europe. Non-Western migrants had already been flooding into Europe for decades. Leaders refused to stop it for many reasons. Some saw migrants as cheap labor. Others were afraid of being branded racist for opposing it. But long before the present crisis, experts were asking if Europe would still be Europe if immigrants someday outnumbered natives.
It's increasingly clear in Western European countries that as the populations approach a tipping point, that there are increasing groups of people who are essentially asking the question, if the political establishment continues to get its way, in 5, in 10, in 20 years' time, how many Germans are going to be left in Germany? How many French people are going to be left in France? How many English people are going to be left in England?
French writer Renaud Camus calls the influx the Great Replacement and says it's the biggest thing to happen to France since the 15th century.
Because what is happening is the population is changing. Can France be the same with a different people? And obviously the answer is no.
For years, Sweden has taken in more migrants per capita than any other European nation. And the experiment has not gone well. Segregation and unemployment among migrants remain high. Predominantly migrant gangs have developed a habit recently of throwing hand grenades at each other during street battles. Last year, Swedish police reported that some areas had become dangerous for law enforcement to enter. Officials denied that the areas are no-go zones, but what was described to us certainly sounded like no-go zones.
Police officers and also fire brigade, ambulance services, when they are coming to these areas, they are attacked. The kids are throwing stones at them, and let's say they are more or less riots. So the police have been attacked by youngsters and so on, of course. So there's a lot of firearms, handguns, especially.
Swedish economist Tino Sanandaji says his country's model faces collapse.
You don't have to be Nostradamus to predict the future. You go to cities like Malmö, Sweden's third city, that are 20 years ahead demographically. That's what the rest of Sweden is going to be. And Malmö has of the 300 Swedish municipalities, it's bottom 10, whatever social outcome you look. Employment, unemployment, school outcomes, poverty.
Sweden's immigration policy doesn't work. The statistics clearly prove it. So why is Sweden bringing in more and more immigrants? And why are opponents of immigration in Sweden and other Western nations branded as racist?
We protest the erecting of fences that just basically make the passage more dangerous.
Sanandaji believes the Swedish left's obsession with immigration and racism has become a kind of religious substitute.
If you want to sort of psychologize, Sweden is one of the most secular countries in the world. Okay, they've lost their moral grounding because and the elitists in particular are aggressively anti-religion, right? So, but people, of course, need some sort of spirituality, morality, some values. And instead, their values are anti-racism. So they created this alternative reality for themselves, where it's the 1930s, and they're the guys fighting Hitler.
But more and more Swedes seem to finally have had enough, because the right-wing anti-immigration Sweden Democrats are now the most popular party in the country.
The local municipalities, government authorities around the country, they're all saying it's not working. We're standing before the collapse of the system almost in Sweden. People living in the multicultural chaos that they created, they see this.
Right-wing nationalist parties are strengthening in most European nations, because in many cases the establishment seems unwilling or unable to stop the migrant influx. A new poll shows immigration is now the #1 political issue in Britain. Gerard Batten is a founding member of UKIP, the UK Independence Party.
Why would you allow unlimited immigration? It's madness. But it's a political thing, you see, is that so long as you've got these open borders, the political elite, the left-wing political elite can say, oh, we're good people because, we're not racist like the nasty people who want to control immigration.
Almost 1 million migrants have arrived in Germany this year alone. German public support for open borders is falling. Asylum shelters are being firebombed. The fear of open borders in Europe seems to be the same fear that is helping to power Donald Trump's surprising campaign for president. Desperate people in need deserve to be helped. But many are asking what will happen to Europe if the refugee surge doesn't stop. Dale Hurd, CBN News, reporting from Europe.
This week's special guest for Behind Headlines is Tim Dieppe, who's Head of Public Policy at Christian Concern. Tim, a warm welcome to Behind Headlines.
Thank you, Simon. Great to be with you.
It's a pleasure. And Tim, what are your thoughts on the very courageous speech made by our Home Secretary Suella Braverman last week in the United States, where she compared uncontrolled mass illegal immigration to that of an existential threat?
Yes, well, Simon, I think she did give a very bold speech with a lot of common sense in it, actually. I read the whole thing. And of course, she's right. You can't have uncontrolled immigration in any nation. You would end up not having really a nation to govern anymore, because just anybody can enter and anybody can leave and there'd be no actual nation. So I think everybody agrees that you need to have some controls on immigration. There is a level of immigration that is helpful and good, and then there's a level of immigration where it's completely out of control and there's too much. And she's saying, well, it's gone over to that level where it's too much at the moment, and we need to control it. And most people agree with that. The opinion polls consistently say this is a concern of most people in the nation, and of course in many nations around the world as well. And that we need to find systems and find ways of controlling and organising immigration in a proper way so that it's going to work properly for us. And she criticised multiculturalism, which of course many people have criticised before. In fact, I wrote an article, What's Wrong with Multiculturalism, a few years back, which you can find on the internet. And very senior politicians, Angela Merkel, David Cameron, Nicolas Sarkozy, have all said multiculturalism has failed. And of course, it was destined to fail because multiculturalism is saying all cultures are equal, just celebrate and respect every culture. And that's clearly not true. For example, an Islamic culture discriminates against women and against non-Muslims, and a culture that encourages slavery isn't as good as a culture that discourages slavery, for example. So multiculturalism is inherently unstable because it basically creates a whole different set of cultures which nobody can unite around, and was bound to fail. And so we really need to establish, again, what our real culture is. It used to be founded on Christianity, on biblical values, and that's what I want, and we at Christian Concern want to see the nation get back to. And mass immigration isn't helping that.
Thank you very much for that helpful insight, Tim. Now, you speak a bit about multiculturalism there, and what a lot of people did in responding to Suella Braverman's speech is they sensationalized what she was saying, and even in some cases, on the extreme side of things, tried to paint her as being against the multiple ethnicities that we have in our society, and borderline painted her as propagating racial ideologies. But help us think again through how multiculturalism is an ideology that is quite different from accepting and tolerating the presence of different ethnicities. Help our viewers think through that.
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, Suella Braverman herself is from an immigrant family, isn't she, with a different ethnicity to what might naturally be the dominant ethnicity in Britain. So that clearly she's not against multi-ethnicity. She's like, her family came and immigrated. That immigration is not a bad thing per se. There should be a level of immigration from people, including people of different ethnicities. And multiculturalism is not the same as criticizing ethnicity or wanting a particular ethnicity. We want a culture that has democracy, freedom of speech, rule of law, all these things that we value very well and recognize very well. And a lot of people immigrating into the country will integrate into that very well. For example, Hong Kong immigrants integrate very well into that because they're used to a British style of law and a British style of government from when we ruled that place. But a lot of other immigrants don't naturally assimilate so well, and in fact, we see high rates of crime in some areas and causes of crime from this and so on, and they don't naturally assimilate, or it takes a lot of time for them to assimilate, and then that creates problems for the culture and challenges the culture and destabilizes the culture. Because you have an increasing number of people who don't really recognize or respect the culture as it is. So this is not about ethnicity, it's about different cultures and respecting the culture and integrating into the culture. And if you want to immigrate into the country, you need to be someone who will assimilate, integrate, become part of the culture, respect the democracy, respect the rule of law, and go along with that and become part of that, rather than somebody who wants to maintain their old culture and create a monocultural enclave in a particular part of the country or something, and try and change laws or change the system and change the culture that we're in. And that's the kind of tension that we're in here. It's about culture, it's about preserving culture, as well as all the massive economic impacts. It costs us £8 million a day at the moment to house all of these refugees, asylum seekers in hotels. I mean, it's a huge cost, as well as the drain on resources like NHS, doctors, schools, roads, social services, all of these other things. That is unsustainable at the moment.
And Tim, how much can you say that this illegal immigration crisis that not only Britain's facing, but the entire Western world is facing, is because of globalist policies of having open borders as a means to try and destroy and break down the nation state, making it easier to create a one world government?
Well, I think there was sort of very much an open border kind of policy that was around. And then I think in the sort of crisis around 2016, 2015, there were so many immigrants that the borders came back down again in many ways. And I think that people recognise this. We can't just have millions of people crossing over borders and then countries expected to deal with that and cope with that. Now, immigration has slowed down a bit since then, but there are still people who advocate for a global system of open borders. That's just unworkable. It's just completely impractical. It cannot work. Any nation must be able to protect its borders, otherwise it can't exist as a nation. You know, that's standard. Even in the Bible, the Israelites had to respect the borders of one of the nations and go around it rather than go inside the border when the king didn't want them to. There's a natural respect of borders that there should be there. And I think that's right and proper. And it's kind of the way God set it up, with different nations having different borders that should be respected by other nations and by people as well. That's not to ban immigration, of course, but, you know, and trade and travel and all of these kind of things. But there should be limits. There need to be limits. There needs to be controls on the amount of these things.
And Tim, how much do we need to take into account kind of Islamic theology of hijra? And this is Islam's attempt to take over the West, using the Prophet Muhammad's example of when he took over Mecca when he was in Medina.
Well, you're right, Simon. There is an Islamic doctrine of al-hijra, of migration, which deliberately seeks to expand Islamic influence by migrating to other countries and establishing Islamic culture there, setting up mosques and so on. And that is definitely part of what's happening. I don't think that many Muslims are really properly aware of that, are properly culturally, you know, like consciously aware of it. But certainly there are some Islamic leaders and people who are encouraging this and wanting this to happen and seeing it as a way of dominating or, you know, or creating Islamic influence in certain areas. And of course, we have this in Britain. And there are certain areas of Britain where, you know, more than 50% of the population, according to the latest census, is Islamic. And there is a rival legal system, Sharia courts, something like 85 to 100 Sharia courts around the country, sort of basically establishing an alternative parallel legal system. This is not integration. This is like an attempt to create a separate system. And you could talk about Islamic finance as well in the same sort of vein. And this is a challenge. And you know, obviously, you know, and at the extremist end, you have terrorism as well, which is trying to disrupt our culture as well. So there are all of these issues to take into account when you think about immigration as well. You're right.
Well, Tim Diop, Head of Public Policy with Christian Concern, thank you very, very much for your incisive insights into the threat of this immigration that's unhindered into our society. Thank you for joining us on the program.
Thank you.
And such a pleasure to have Tim Diop as our special guest on Behind the Headlines this week, and really appreciate his viewpoint, not only on multiculturalism, but the dangers of mass, uncontrolled, illegal immigration. Regan, there's also another aspect that she makes in this speech, and she makes the kind of, Suella Braverman makes the practical argument against uncontrolled illegal mass immigration. And the figures here are nothing less than absolutely staggering. She says that we have witnessed an unprecedented rise in illegal immigration to the UK by small boats, and that 109,000 have crossed the channel since 2018, and 45,000 have arrived this year alone. She says the cost of funding the asylum system has doubled and now stands at $4 billion a year, and 10 years ago it was 500 million. It says it costs the taxpayer £8 million per day to provide accommodation for migrants. It says that in March, a third of all hotel rooms in Ireland are used to accommodate migrants. It says in New York City, there are 40,000 migrants in hotels, and the mayor of New York, Eric Adams, said that the migrant crisis will destroy New York City. And it says it cost New York City $10 billion annually to support 300,000 asylum seekers coming through America through its southern border. And so we say that this is a massive problem. It's just not Britain that is dealing with this migrant crisis, as we saw in that excellent CBN News report. Europe is facing this huge migrant crisis. The United States is, all pretty much as a result of policies of the UN's open borders. And it's having a devastating impact on our culture, our society. I mean, we can't, how much money, for example, could we spend 4 billion on schools, on healthcare, on education, of improving our infrastructure? But instead, this is being spent on migrants coming to this country. And if you consider that the vast majority of those coming on the small boats and making that crossing across the English Channel, 70% of them are young men under the age of 40.
There are a few reasons to consider, and I want to reiterate, you know, we are not against immigration per se. We believe that there's a place and there's a time and there's a way for immigration. But uncontrolled, en masse, illegal immigration is putting more and more pressure on public services. It's creating massive impact. It is behind 45% demand for new housing in England as well. And the reality is that there are many who have been housed in hotels for a year or 2 years, sometimes maybe maximum of 3 years. And when it's time to, when asylum has been granted, there's release from the hotel, there's not the housing to accommodate, there's not the housing to provide. And you have a situation where there are disjointed, well, let me just use a practical example. An individual I know who we provided for a little while, not a Christian, admittedly not seeking asylum for religious persecution. He is Muslim, not particularly practicing, from Libya. He found himself here. There were different things going on due to the ongoing chaos in Libya. I understand, not a pleasant situation or environment. I have sympathy with and for him. But this is a man in his late 30s who, by his own profession, has never worked. He has done a bit of a university course, but decided he didn't want to do that. He doesn't have a trade. He's in his late 30s, I remind you. There's opportunities to work in Libya. He acknowledged that, but he just has never found anything that he really likes doing. So he's trying to live a life where it's all tailored to him, essentially. He was staying in Bournemouth. He didn't get on well in Bournemouth, and yes, he was very badly treated in a hotel in Bournemouth. So he comes to London. But the system is such that he cannot just request to be placed in London. He refused multiple replacements to other parts of the country until finally he agreed to, with much pleading with him, to go to another place outside the city. But they are taking these individuals who they have no real claim, and we've seen even some lawyers recently getting in trouble for souping up asylum claims, saying they were the victim of torture or they were the victim of persecution in some way when they weren't. And then others, claiming, in some cases, I have very dear friends who came as asylum seekers from Iran, and they have legitimate claims to asylum. They've been walking with the Lord and growing in their faith. They acknowledge that there are many people who come over on the boats and in the vans who are not legitimately seeking asylum for grounds of religious persecution. There are many people who are coming as economic migrants, and you can say, on a human level, can you understand why someone would want to be here? Yes, you can understand that. At the same time, mass, uncontrolled immigration will cause what's attractive to people about the UK to be completely destroyed and eroded. the health system that we have, the public services that are there, everything across the board is going to come under immense pressure. Even our school system, the English secondary schools are needing to find an extra 213,000 places by 2026 compared to 2020. It's unsustainable pressure. This isn't about disliking people. This isn't about being prejudicial about people. It is about recognizing that there are legitimate claims to asylum and there are illegitimate claims to asylum. It's about having the wisdom really to distinguish between what is what and having the resource to investigate that properly. But it's also about being honest and open that our society cannot continue to function in a healthy way with en masse, uncontrolled immigration. You mentioned the age and the stage of many coming over. There's an argument to be made that the journey is very dangerous. It's not safe for women and children. That's why I am very impressed when I encounter, and I have met women and children, two very young boys who came with their mother, and you see and you hear their stories, and your heart goes out, and you recognize there are legitimate stories, but the vast majority of those coming over are not, there's something not quite checking out.
Okay, so you're American and I'm British, and if we have proper legislation in place. So I worked in the States. I could only work for 3 months, very hard to get a visa to work in the United States, unless you get the J visa or you get a student visa to actually work there, or you need a green card, for example.
Right.
Now, I could have, when I was working in Washington D.C, said, I'm not going back. I love the States so much. I'm going to work here illegally, right? I'm breaking the law by doing that. And so this is what these migrants are also doing. And we have to also look at the definition of what a migrant is compared to a refugee. Now, a refugee is someone who's been forced to flee from their country because of persecution or war. And so therefore they find they don't have a home any longer. And migrants are those who want to come over to have a better life. Now, we're having a situation, thanks to the United Nations Charter on Refugees, that refugees are essentially allowed to choose where they want to live. So they want to say, I want to live in Britain, but the first country I entered into Europe was Italy. So instead of making their claim in Italy, they'll travel from Italy all the way up through France to then do that border crossing across the English Channel to come here. But there is another kind of danger that we need to look at with uncontrolled mass immigration, and Suella Braverman points that out very clearly. And this is the threat to national security. She says that illegal migration threatens public safety and national security. Says that police chiefs have warned her of an increase in criminality, drugs, exploitation and prostitution. According to the French President Macron, he said that illegal migrants commit half of all crimes in Paris. There's also said that illegal migrants are tools used by hostile states against the West. We say that Putin has weaponized illegal migration by sending migrants to Belarus to infiltrate both Poland and Lithuania, and the Wagner Group have also been forcing migrants out of Africa into Europe. So we've got this excellent CBN News report about what's happening on Hungary's border.
This is the border between Serbia and Hungary. This is the fence, often referred to as a wall, that draws so much criticism from Western Europe and much of the world. It went up 6 years ago as hundreds of thousands of migrants from Syria and other countries stormed through this Central European country on their way to Germany. A scene that's repeated itself. Today, a warning broadcast in 7 languages.
Approaching the border fence or touching it can cause injury and pain. I urge you to refrain from committing the crime.
Border police say it's still mainly young men trying to cross the border, often approaching the fence in military formations. Hundreds of migrants attempt to cross each day. Riot teams remain on standby, and now officials are bracing for another wave from Afghanistan.
Around 400 Afghans, including the family members, are now in Hungary, and we definitely will take care of them. But here there's a full stop. We will not receive anyone else. We will protect our border, we will withstand the pressure, and we will continue to stick to our own right to make our own decision whom we allow to enter the territory of our country and with whom we are ready to live together.
We're getting an aerial view of the border. Hungarian officials tell us in the summer of 2015, 150,000 refugees were walking across the border every month. They walked miles across a great expanse of quiet farmland, shocking residents.
Mezőgazdasági kár keletkezett. There were a lot of damage in the agriculture.
Kint levő tanyákba bementek.
There were some farms, you know, and just went into the
lakosságot, ez
houses,
nagyon irritáltak.
which was very much irritating to the people living here.
General Bakandi George, Hungary's chief national security advisor, was waiting for us when we landed at the border. Could you have curbed this problem without a fence?
Egészen biztosan nem. Kerítés kellett ahhoz, hogy az előzönlést, a határátlépést akadályozzák. Ez nem megy másképp.
In a country with a history of oppressive occupations and a post-World War I treaty that dramatically reduced its size, Hungary is unapologetic about preserving its culture built on the foundation of Christianity.
És nyilvánvalóan a migráció nagyon...
Migration already brought forward huge cultural clash and will bring even more.
Under Soviet rule, Pastor Nemeth Sandor was forced to practice his faith underground. Today, he leads the largest evangelical church in the country.
Tragikus hibának tartanám.
I believe it's a tragic mistake.
Hogy Pál apostolnak az örökségét eltékozolná Európa.
Waste the heritage of the Apostle Paul.
Isten Pál apostolt Európába küldte.
God sent the Apostle Paul.
Ő rakta le Európában a kereszténységnek az alapját.
He laid the foundations of Christianity on this continent.
Senior Hungarian officials tell CBN News it's simple. They don't want a multicultural society.
We think that migration is harmful. It creates parallel societies. People losing their roots and their traditions. Also, promoting migration gives room to trafficking organizations and have also many security concerns.
Asbay and other officials say while they're not opposed to legal migration, the government seeks to help people where they are, rather than transporting them to a foreign culture. And in the face of criticism from the European Union and much of the world, Hungary sees securing its borders as key to its survival.
The Judeo-Christian revelation and values are something I am willing to fight for at the moment.
Jennifer Wishon, CBN News, reporting from Hungary's southern border.
Well, thankful as always for our friends at CBN and their analysis. Suella Braverman's speech also contained unpacking of what she calls the democratic argument against en masse uncontrolled immigration. Opinion polls and the national votes, the people the world over want their governments to control their borders. UK public has backed the Rwanda project, is what she indicated. I'm not so certain if maybe my area is different. It is Islington, so perhaps the general prevailing attitude was against that project. Certainly they couldn't pull it off in the end, as we saw. 6 in 10 voters in the red wall seats have supported stopping migrants, and this is potentially going to be the straw that breaks the camel's back for them, because in supporting stopping migrants, we've not really seen the Conservative Party successful in its promise to do that. 72% of EU citizens are in favor of reinforcing border controls over migrants. More than half of Americans believe that their southern border is being invaded in a poll in August of 2022. There's all sorts that we could do and say to talk a little bit about that and balance it perhaps a bit more. But we do need to consider the United Nations Global Compact for Migration, which is a key document in our discussion. The decision to develop and adopt a global compact for migration was taken at a summit of heads of state and government hosted by the UN General Assembly in New York on the 19th of September 2016. The commitment to develop the compact was contained in the New York Declaration for Refugees and Migrants adopted by all 193 member states of the UN. The New York Declaration set out a range of commitments on refugees and migration policy and also included a commitment to a separate global compact on refugees. The final text of the GCR was endorsed by the UN General Assembly on 17th of December 2018, with 2 countries voting against, the USA and Hungary, and 3 abstaining, Eritrea, Libya, and the Dominican Republic. The GCR is technically non-binding. Its development and adoption did not attract the same level of controversy as that of the GCM. Opposition to the compact, the U.S. government announced in December 2017 that it would not be participating in the GCM. It said that the New York Declaration was inconsistent and with the Trump administration's immigration principles at the time and incompatible with the idea of U.S. sovereignty. In July of 2018, Hungary also pulled out. Between October and December of 2018, Austria, Bulgaria, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Poland, Australia, and Israel also indicated that they would not be participating in the compact. Switzerland and Italy said they would be abstaining, it's basically not participating, pending parliamentary decisions on whether to participate. Dispute within the ruling coalition in Belgium over participation in the compact led the Belgian government to collapse as well on that. Opposition to the GCM was encouraged by an online campaign by far-right and anti-immigrant activists, yes.
That's how the UN described them.
That's how the UN described them, exactly. But this involved claims that the GCM would declare migration as a human right and make criticism of migration a criminal offence, and that it encouraged mass immigration. In the UK, there was a petition on the UK government and parliamentary websites calling on the UK government not to agree to the compact, which amassed eventually over 130,000 signatures.
I mean, this is essentially, we have to put the blame at this whole crisis of the globalists, the United Nations, including the EU with the Schengen borders, as allowing mass-controlled illegal immigration to actually destroy the nation state, making it easier to bring about a one world government. So again, we're seeing how this kind of fits into Bible prophecy, and the infrastructure is being built essentially for the Antichrist, where essentially the world will not have any borders. And this is the plan of the globalists. But in doing so, this is effectively destroying the West, and the West is committing what amounts to national suicide. We're destroying our culture, we're destroying our heritage, we're destroying our value system, we're destroying our way of life, because this uncontrolled illegal immigration is unsustainable. And then we have the courts doing everything they can to fight against the British government's attempt to stop this uncontrolled illegal immigration. And this is why I think Suella Braverman has been so clever in pitching for a reform of the entire globalist UN system on refugees and what marks a person as a refugee in comparison to a migrant, so that our nations can be free of this mayhem that potentially will destroy our entire Western civilization.
Yeah, and I want to reiterate, I think the issue is, from my perspective, not so much that this is destroying our civilization. I think we've already destroyed the foundations of our civilization. We are not a Christian country, okay? Our rootings, our foundation is still has some remnants, some vestiges of a Christian ethos. How we are constituted still owes so much more to a Judeo-Christian heritage than any other world system and ideology. However, we have seen the systematic implosion of that even our churches en masse are not preaching the gospel as they ought. And so this has opened the door for this confusion, really, that's led to the multicultural ideology, which religiously pluralistic, welcomes, embraces, and accepts all worldviews and all world systems, and struggles to make the very simple request, demand, or criteria for acceptance of assimilation and acclimatization into British society. What is British society? It's not that clear anymore, unfortunately.
Yeah, but we also have to take into account as well the kind of hijra policy as a way of declaring war on the West as well. And this is an Islamic theology about taking new lands for Islam, for Muhammad, and therefore to actually turn entire continents like Europe potentially into an Islamic state through migration. So this is a kind of deliberate ploy put out by Islamic theologians in order to take over the West. And we're seeing that in the United States, that almost 2.8 million illegal immigrations have entered America from its southern border. And that poses a direct threat to American sovereignty as a nation state. And our nations can no longer continue to go down this path unless the world wakes up. And this is what Suella Braverman tried to do, to wake the West up to the dangers we face of uncontrolled mass immigration.
Thank you so much, Simon, for this evening's program and Behind the Headlines. Thank you, viewers, for tuning in. This is a topic that we'll, I'm sure, continue having calls to address. As we seek to engage this world, let's remember to be lights. Let's remember to love those who are around us, regardless of who they are or where they come from. We need to recognize, though, that the gospel is truth, and the gospel is what we need to present to change our culture and its system. Bless you, and we'll hope to see you next time, God willing, for another edition of Behind the Headlines.